morning. I am independent journalist Georgia Fort. This morning, we are taking a look at a new study that came out that has shown over 90% of large U.S. cities are pricing out their Black residents. And when you think about the lack of affordability in metro areas, what does this mean? What does this mean for the quality of life of Black residents? What does this mean for the future of metro areas? There's so much to unpack here, but it should not be surprising as we've seen prices for homes skyrocket. We've seen the rent in units that are for lease skyrocket. And so this is not really surprising, Anthony, but to me, it is disturbing that this is disproportionately affecting Black people.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we see that trend all the way across. Good morning, Georgia. one of the things that we see across, there's that adage that we have experienced over and over again. When society catches a cold, people of color and marginalized communities catch the flu, and so. This, in addition to the inflation that we see, we see the issue with housing stock in many of the cities around. All of those things amount to folks who are most vulnerable, right? Who are most at the margins, at the edges. I have seen even in my church parish community the amounts of folks needing and seeking help from our church community and some of the communal groups and the co-ops that we have established are increasing. The requests for benevolence are increasing as well. And so we have seen this trend. We kind of, there's so many things going on that we've taken this may not have been on front and center for many folks, given all the things that are going on, but we have seen that increase only be exacerbated by what's happening with the pandemic. So it's a real problem.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I was thinking about is the wealth gap. So when you talk about something being affordable, if the white wealth, I'm trying to look it up here, I think it's almost 200,000 for white households, which is almost 8 times that of the typical Black household, which is under 30,000. So, of course, if you think about affordability, if the average white household is earning $200,000 a year, there's a lot that's affordable for them. If you are earning less than $30,000 a year, it may be difficult to find any kind of housing that can accommodate the size of your family, right? So there are so many layers, but that has decided that housing is a luxury, right? And now we can begin to understand why we're seeing all of these tent encampments all across the country. I remember going to DC and we're driving up to the nation's capital. It's our first time there. And it's like, everybody kind of taken aback, like, wow, the nation's capital. And I think in frames, right, as being a videographer, a photographer, working with the camera a lot, I always think of frames. In the same frame of our nation's capital is a tent encampment. And so, here you have folks who are living in a tent and their backdrop is the capital. And so fundamentally, at some point, I feel like our country has taken a wrong turn somewhere because, what does that say? What does just that one statistic say that 90% of large U.S. cities are unaffordable for Black people? What does that say? What are we saying? We don't want you here. Go somewhere else. There has to be a shift in economics. And I thought we were approaching on this after the murder of George Floyd, when we had all these corporations make these large declarations to Black economics. But sadly, a lot of them have not fulfilled their commitments.
Well, and this is indicative of some of the gaps across. When you talked about that wealth gap, it's I think an important piece in there is that in all the research, and especially some of the stuff coming out of Pew Research, it's not just a gap, it's also a widening gap. It's continuing to grow, which is very problematic. But then also, we're seeing that things aren't moving in lockstep. So let's take, for example, in a historical housing space, right? When people of color, in particular Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, were pushed out of housing markets or kept out of housing markets, redlined around, so that those housing markets, were problematic around. That also created a space in which you have an imbalance and a huge gap between home ownership. So the bank of the home of owned home that you could borrow against, that you can use as a buoy whenever these things move, is also not equal. So you have that into the mix. So these imbalances in not just other places are also having an effect of what you're describing. I will also add too that one of the things that we see is, as luxury housing and other things are being built for a particular group of a dwindling group of folks who can afford that, less attention is being put onto the affordable options that are there in the city sprawl. And so and in addition to not keeping up with the pace of income. So even if I could keep pace with my job and my incomes that are happening in the job that I'm working, to keep up with the rising cost of living in particularly the urban areas, I still have those other gaps to contend with. And as you know, we're also the more vulnerable to any shifts that may happen, whether it's health or something like that hits and completely wipes out my bank account. We know that one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States is health-related issues that come up. And folks in the very communities that we're talking about are overrepresented in those areas. And so there's a kind of a perfect storm brewing all around that we don't seem to be addressing.
Yeah, I know our family, Anthony, we were just shopping for a home and we were extremely skeptical that we would even be able to get qualified for a home loan because we're both entrepreneurs. And I mean, the checklist for entrepreneurs to gain access to any kind of financing is extremely challenging. But we actually did get pre-approved for our home loan. And then we were, looking at homes. The homes, number one, are flying off the shelves. Like they will come on the market one day and be gone. They'll come on the market in the morning and they'll be sold by night. But not only that, like there was this one home we absolutely fell in love with. We offered them $45,000 more than asking price, and we were outbid. And that was probably like a cash maximum bid. And it was devastating for our children because they fell in love with the home too. But it is to think of a home going for more than what it's listed. There was another home. We weren't really like that in love with it, but we liked the neighborhood. And I remember going back because I was going to I went to see it and Sarisa was out of town. And so I was going to send him the listing a few days later. And I look and it sold for $60,000 more than the asking price. And when you also think about the nature of real estate, there's no way for you to know who has the highest bid or what the highest bid is so that you could try to outbid it. It's very, you just kind of, you're shooting in the dark, essentially. And so it just was crazy to me. But most of the real estate agents, they're like, yeah, this is just the way the market is. If you really want a house, you have to go all in and offer, the maximum amount that you are eligible for financing. But the economics on that doesn't make sense either. And so the other side, like, obviously, there's a portion of the population whose quality of life is being negatively affected by this. But when we think about the future, we've talked about the future impacts for these metro areas who are pricing out Black people and communities of color. But what happens for all those people who have purchased these homes at inflated prices? That's the other side. When you've talked to economic experts, there's a lot of parallels to what we're seeing now in comparison to what we saw before the last economic recession. And remember when the housing market crashed, like it inflates so much, and eventually it has to come down. And so that's the other side of it, is people you spend $500,000 on a home that's only valued at $350,000. That family is essentially losing, right? Mm-hmm. So there's so much nuance and complexity to this. But what I think is the most urgent and pressing issue is that people's quality of life is being affected. There's some people who just can't afford the bare minimum, and that's not right.
And compounding that coming forward, of course, is the cliff that we're going to hit with inflation, because corrective actions are being done as we speak. And so we're going to see the value of the money that folks have had come together start to decline over time. And so you add that to being inverted in your quote, your equity gain, or what you would hope for as an equity gain over time. You've got a challenge ahead of you. What I will say too is it's also forcing folks to rethink. So one of the things that we're starting to see grow in some of the areas in which we're working with, because as a church leader, we got to get ready, because when these downturns happen and that need comes in there, we're one of the storehouses. We're one of the places that folks come to get some of the things they need, whether it be network connection and all of that. One of the things that is interesting is that folks are rethinking how we go about living. We don't say for South Africa, constitutionally, you have a right to a home. We don't have protections like that here in the United States. And so folks are starting to get creative in some ways. There are new conversations around multi-generational housing, rethinking developments in certain places. There are folks who wanted to do the upgrade that you talked about earlier who can't. We were in that space. We had saved. We had gotten to the point where we're like, yes, we're finally able to go in this market space. And now we had to go back and rethink that and go, we're probably going to need to stay where we are even longer, because we were at this cusp. And there's a whole lot of folks who had built up to this cusp of being able to move from say, for example, renting and primarily as a primary space to finally getting close to zeroing on some land or getting that first house that now is pushed out a little bit. So we've got some things to contend with, but it also is forcing some folks to get creative and to rethink what the living situation looks like. I'll give one example. There's a family who are working with who they all decided to pool around a piece of property that one of their family members had, and they ended up getting little pieces around that. And what they did is they decided to, and of course the building thing is difficult, but they began to kind of build around that house and use the equity in that house to support each other. Now, of course, it's not a buyer's market, but they were able to kind of buckle down and hold it down so that they all saved. They're a little bit more cramped, but what's happening is they're able to save in ways that they didn't before. And that was something that they were only thinking about. But as this began to open up, they're like, you know what, now's the time to start doing that. So, because I always have to look for some silver lining in the mix. There are some creativity that's being born out of here that may be necessary as we try to address the issues in front of us.
Yeah. Well, while I have you, I want to switch gears here a little bit. Major oil and gas companies have been accused of deceiving the government in order to dodge responsibility for climate change. There was a study that came out recently on May 11th. The Environmental Defense Fund released an analysis that highlights the dishonest means of hitting net zero goals and appearing greener on paper. Companies like Shell, Exxon, and Chevron have reportedly offloaded gas and oil assets to smaller companies that are not subject to oversight or public scrutiny. And once these assets are sold, years of climate progress are reset immediately. And this is, I mean, it's unfortunate for all of us because we all live on the same earth. And a lot of these companies have already made, huge errors that have negatively impacted our environment. And so for the government to step in and have this additional oversight has been helpful for all of us. We're making progress, right? But for them to cheat the system, I mean, not only are they making millions of dollars, but, when you think about the oil spills and the pollution, all of these different things that's causing harm to the environment, the fact that they would go out of their way to pass off assets to other companies that don't have the oversight and deceive the government in that way and set us all back environmentally. I mean, at what point is the government going to find them, so in a way that's like so strict that either it whips them in shape or it puts them out of business? Like, how do these companies, how are they allowed to keep doing this?
Well, and one of the heartbreaking pieces of this is that those who are affected most and earliest by this are folks, not just marginalized communities in the United States, but across the globe. It's poor countries, Black and brown countries, indigenous peoples that are feeling the effects first. And so that's what's so problematic and heartbreaking about this. And we, unfortunately, are in a nation that does not seem to be able to marshal the kind of public political will that many others have who have very different markets. But at the same time, let's just juxtapose what would happen if one of these companies are found openly hiding or masking or affecting their financial gain. Or what their income reports or their profit reports are, right? We seem to be more meticulous about that than we are about the things that are actually going to affect our ability to even be healthy on our own planet. So that is a problematic thing, and we are supposed to be taking care of this planet. So that's problematic in that regard. But also too, this also messes with our ability to gauge what this cliff is that we are approaching environmentally, that we have to get in front of, and that's problematic also in and of itself. And so I don't know what an answer would be to for the accountability other than make if our regulatory bodies aren't able to keep up with this. And at the same time, what mechanisms are? The fact that you're talking about this news story is a step in that direction, but we have not seemed to be able to find the motivating factor. Lobbying is what it is. And in terms of rules and oversight and regulatory, the cost of going afoul of one of these companies seems at this current point to be greater than the will of or their concern for being in the zeitgeist of the people. And a lot of our research also shows across the country that a vast majority of folks support rolling back and holding and doing this accountability, but we don't seem to be able to marshal the power to be able to do that, or at least the leverage in order to make somebody to be a good actor. So I hope this report goes even further, so that because that seems to be the only mechanism that's causing folks to react or move.
Yeah. And, I think that, I do a lot of work in spaces that are Black led or that center, BIPOC communities. And it's interesting how in some spaces this is like a leading issue, and people's knowledge and awareness about it far exceeds even my own. And then in some spaces, the environmental issues is not even on people's radar. We have one planet, we have one Earth. If we allow these huge corporations who are already extracting wealth out of our communities, these CEOs who are making billions or millions of dollars and, paying their everyday workers, essential workers, barely minimum wage or a wage that's not livable, right? Not only are they extracting wealth out of our community, but then they are destroying our planet, it's interesting how some people really see this as a pressing issue. They're willing to stand up for it. And other people who it's not even something that they've ever even thought about or talked about yet. And still every day you walk outside and, you're living on this planet. How can we not think about this? There's been other reports that have come out, that have looked at, like, if we don't fix things and we allow things to continue the way they are and progressively get worse, in 50 years from now, what is this planet going to look like? But these are real conversations that we have to have, because 50 years from now we're only 2 generations removed from that. Think about when your kids have kids, and maybe their kids have kids, maybe like a lot of us will still be here in 50 years. What is it going to look like if we continue to allow these corporations to go down the path that they're going? But what control do we have when they're deceiving even the government, and we're watching that now happen without penalty?
Well, and all of that happening in the course of having actual real options on the table. That's the infuriating part about what you just said for me, is we have things that we can do. Our investments in greener approaches to energy, we could be pouring all of our assets there, but we don't seem to be doing that. We continue this tract of wrong by choice, right by necessity. And unfortunately, the necessity in this regard, there's a point at which once you feel it, it's already too late. And so once you truly feel it, right? And I mean, and I'm talking to you as in us who are driving the ship in this regard. But there's also another thing that's happening too, right? The era of gushers, the era of this wanton abandoned energy production in the way, and especially it's dependent on fossil fuels. Yeah, that's done. We have depleted the huge, easily accessible oil. And so you're actually going to see that continue to decline. Now, the zeitgeist or your psyche would say that means that we have to start looking for new methods of energy. We don't seem to be doing that. We seem to be doubling down on the dirtiest. We seem to be doubling down on the most harmful to the environment. You would assume that there would be this boom in all of these other renewable areas, and there is some in that direction, but we're not. This should be our moon race. But we don't seem to be marshaling in the same way. And that's the problematic piece. So that's the infuriating piece about what you just said is we have options. We have real things that we can do, but that doesn't seem to be capturing our attention or our pocketbooks.
You just made me think of something too. During the pandemic, when folks had to work from home, they saw the environment. There was just huge improvement because people weren't commuting every day. You didn't have all of the pollution from vehicles. So on top of green energy, on top of, added incentives for, just different fuel efficiency or wind energy or light energy, right? Also, why did these corporations force people to go back into the workplace? If it was better for the environment for us to stay home and people were just as productive, now we're forcing people to commute every single day, and we know what those emissions do to our environment. So Anthony, you're absolutely right. We have all the resources to do better. We have all the research that shows what's effective, and yet and still here we are and not doing better. So this is going to be something I continue to follow. Environmental issues have been a priority for me ever since I became an independent journalist. So it fascinates me that these huge corporations are allowed to deceive the public, deceive the government, and essentially do it without any penalty. But we are on the clock. So we'll see you next week. But for those of you watching, stick around for more on the Benjamin Dixon Morning Show.